Good morning, and today we have Winnie Varghese, Revd Winnie Varghese. She's part of the clergy team at Trinity Wall Street in New York. And Winnie, I don't know what you've prepared for us today. What are you wanting to share with us at this time that there's a lot of tension around? What are your reflections on that as we get going this morning?
Yeah, as I was sharing with you before we started, I've been spending the week thinking about a group of Benedictine nuns in Pennsylvania who I was supposed to be on retreat with, and they are, they're above 75, most of them, and are Benedictines. They have served and been in tough communities and know all kinds of people for their whole lives. And I've been thinking about it from their perspective and what they've seen over the last 70 years as faithful Christian women. And they've seen their part of Pennsylvania gutted in terms of industry. They've seen racial tension flare and calm back down many, many times. And they've probably had to question their own sense of their identity and what this nation is and what it's for as Catholic women. And so in trying to think about how to talk with them and not wanting to take them out of the day-to-day of the real news of the day, it's been an interesting exercise in trying to talk about what America is. And what Black Lives Matter is in response to the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, and the fact of a police shooting that left a child on the concrete for 4 hours dead in the middle of a community, and the response to that shooting, right? It would have been one horrible thing if it happened, horrible. But the fact that the person who had died was immediately demonized in some ways. The police officer was defended. The responses to that are what the current Black Lives Matter movement comes from. And in the course of that movement forming in Ferguson of young adult activists, really remarkable activists, a lot of Black women, but Black women and men, overwhelmingly Black women, with a very strong analysis of what was happening in their communities. They knew exactly what was happening in the history of that and what this moment meant. And in light of that, thinking about the power of the police in our country. And so what I think we're seeing is 5 years of very smart organizing that has helped America to understand the vulnerability of Black and brown bodies to the police in our country, because there have been many George Floyds. We've had plenty of Ahmaud Arbery's. I'm from Dallas, Texas. I mean, that's not unfortunately, it's not an uncommon story. The fact that the story is taken seriously in some quarters can become a story in major news media, that we can sustain our attention and not demonize the victim immediately. That's a change in us. We are changing. Emmett Till was killed equally horribly and was a child, and his mother had an open casket where you could see his bloated baby body, right? And the woman who accused him has said that she lied, she made it up, but that kind of violence was possible with no repercussions. That you could bomb a Sunday school of 3 little girls. No one went to jail, right? Not for a long, long, long time. Recently, people have. That's what shifted, is that we're doing something about George Floyd now, and that happened a couple of months ago. And that's with some very, very smart organizing by really brilliant, I think, leaders in our country. And in the church, I think we have a long heritage of being on the right and wrong side of these movements, and it's a rich heritage to draw from. The Black church has understood and borne the pain of this kind of violence from its founding on. It's founded out of this kind of the suffering of slavery in our country, and so is exactly spot on. Kind of can speak to the whole nation when things like this happen. The white church, and we are unfortunately that divided, less able. It's not true that no one has been able, but less able. So what's different in this time is in my colleague group, one of my friends on Twitter said, did anyone in your church say anything about George Floyd on Sunday a couple of weeks ago? And I responded with, I don't know anyone who didn't talk about that, and in my church. And I said, maybe we're lucky in the Episcopal Church. I don't know, but I don't know anyone whose church wasn't able and ready to wrestle. And that's a huge change in the last 5 years, and it's not an accident.
So, I mean, you reflecting as a pastor on this, what are some of the work, and you're working in a mixed team, I guess, in at Trinity Wall Street. What are some of your observations about how to move things forward when many people may be feeling a little bit nervous about what are the next steps?
I think the truth is that that different communities receive this information in different ways. And it's important to pay attention to everyone. And it's important to think about which voices you prioritize, right? And so there's multiple voices. There's not just two, but one is in our community, we feel this. I was in a call yesterday with a group I think there was one man in the group, overwhelmingly women, overwhelmingly older women, but mixed by race, but overwhelmingly Black and Caribbean. And these are mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, talking about their husbands, their fathers, their sons, their grandchildren. Lonnie talking about himself and his life. And the white people on that call hearing it and saying they didn't want to burden this community with their work and needing and their sorrow in their own heritage and history and complicity and racism and understanding of that. At the same time, we're so grateful for the group where they were allowed to hear and wanted to be about change, understanding that we're talking about generational change. But I think what happened in that group is the women that were leading it, that were talking about their own families and their own fear for their families right now, were given space to talk and to lead that. And the facilitator of the group, which is a person on our clergy team, it created that as a pastoral space for that conversation to happen. That's clearly a pastoral conversation that has implications for action. But she's been very clear that she's holding that as a pastoral space. It has historically, that meeting is about grief and loss. So all of that fits, but it fits in this larger frame of what's happening in our country. So I think it's important. I think what a church can do is hear what's happening to human beings. We're good at that. We're supposed to be good at that. I mean, I guess that's something to question in your community, if whose voices you can hear. And if it's safe in your community for people to speak and to hold that kind of space. And then I think, and we work on this a lot in our country. The first time I encountered this idea was in 1989, and it was pretty well established that there's a lot of grief for white people in whiteness and the coming to awareness of white supremacy. There's a lot of writing about that, a lot of pastoral work around that. And that's important work to do. And it can bring out a lot of frustration and despair. It's a tough thing, right? About identity that hasn't been questioned before. Yeah. And there needs to be space for that. I don't think you can just say, now that you have this information, let's all move forward collectively together. Mm-hmm. There's a lot more to it, and there has to be space for that. Mm-hmm. And then my sense is, and I think we were talking about this yesterday in our group, those things have to happen at the same time, right? That we have to be listening to truths, creating spaces in ourselves to hear those truths if they're not our experiences, kind of wrestling with what that means for us about who we thought we were and what our identity is, so that we can find a way to figuring out how we become part of the communities that we all want to see, right? That are whole and healing and safe.
So, I mean, what you're talking about resonates a lot in relation to, truth and recognition and reconciliation processes, which normally take place after some very deep subsequent trauma has happened. And when you're talking about slavery, we're talking about generations, centuries of hidden history at one level. Yeah. Never hidden, actually, for those who were oppressed. And that was a history that was kept alive in the community's memory, but hidden by those in power. Now, have you got some reflections on all of that? Because that actually seeps right into Europe as well as into American history. Yeah. Transatlantic slavery is a European memory as well, but the outputs of that slavery, if you like, those who were enslaved, mainly ended up settling and having to work out their lives and their very mitigated freedoms in America. Have you got some thoughts as an American and person of color looking across at Europe?
Yeah. someone, an old Indian guy, when I was little, remember like my dad and some friends talking about how they decided where they went to college, you know, and my dad came to the US, people went to the UK and Canada, whatever. And someone, I think it might have been, so in the course of this conversation, their parents were around, and they were talking about the UK, and one of the fathers who had, you know, lived, my parents too, my dad's of the age where he remembers when the British left, right? That one of their fathers said, well, why would you go there if we've just got them out of here? Like, what are you doing? And of course, there's more to it, right? Where the centers of power are and legitimacy. And then this other one kind of flippantly saying that he used the term London, which I think it's a confusion with loo, but it was used in their community as the name for the toilet. Like, that's the rage that that was in that community. There was an awareness of what had been stripped from their communities. People knew about the Bengal famines, both of them. You know, Churchill was the person who created that. I mean, what was stripped from just in India, like what was stripped from the country was known. Yes. Right, that was part of a popular history and the independence movement. But then the need to return to that center if you wanted to function in this worldwide economy, which now centered on Europe, yes. And then later the US. Even when my dad came to the US, it wasn't clear that it fully centered on the US yet. It really still was Europe. This sense of both displacement and anger, and identity, kind of the stripping of identity, and place, and the possibility of thriving in the place that you're in, and how the wealth of the planet had been skewed. Is it Dalrymple that always uses is it 22% of the world's economy was in India before the British arrived, was generated in India before, and then it was 8 when the British left, and it's the reverse. It was 8% in Britain and then 22. That radical shifting happened all over the planet. And I think for Europe in particular, the wealth with unseen sources is the danger here for Europe. That it's just a beautiful city. And as you're seeing, and it's kind of remarkable for us to watch those cities kind of wrestling, especially the cities made on the slave trade in England. It's fascinating for us to watch, because that's not a history we know. Many of us in the US, we're learning it from Caribbean folks and from people in England. We don't, like, we know that in the Southeast and Northeast, many of the original family, like the original Episcopal families, Anglican families, were slave traders, not just slave owners, but traders. So a lot of the great wealth of the Northeast and of New York City comes from the slave trade. The wealth that would have built at Trinity Wall Street, and that built Wall Street, was the trade, not just the actual act of slavery on our land. But this larger trade is less known to us, so I think it's something we're learning. But it's so visible in the grand cities of Europe. It's where all that money came from. Yes, absolutely. Colonialism and slavery. There's no other place. And so that that generation of my father's peer group would have said, and so we'll never go there. There's nothing to see. You've got to go to the airport to get to India. We'll do that. I think I was in Heathrow my whole life. Like, I've been in Heathrow Airport many, many times. I never stood in London until I was, I think, in my late 30s. It never occurred to me. It kind of, I just kind of absorbed it from these conversations, that there's this place that has done such violence to us, and all of its pleasures come from the suffering of our people, right? Tainted. Yeah, and so I never thought it, and I frankly never made the connection. My family is Orthodox, that when I became Episcopal, that had anything to do with England, because the Episcopal Church has nothing to do with England. It just doesn't. That connection doesn't happen on the ground necessarily. So that all kind of settled in much, much later, and then even how we became part of that communion as Orthodox people is because of colonialism, that we were all absorbed. In this country, the difference you see is, like in the Caribbean, the children of enslaved people are here, and the children of enslavers who made their wealth in that way are here, and the wealth of the cities that the nation that the enslaved built is here, is around them, and denies them. Yes, right? DC was actually, it was designed. Washington DC was designed by a Black man. Like, the great irony of that is, it's Benjamin Banneker. It's shocking that it's not just theoretically, in principle, was this country built by Black America. It was built by Black America, right? And the resistance to that in our history is also something that I think we're like you all. Our history is, the history you learn in school is very idealistic. We're the best country in the world for everyone, we've rarely, if ever, made a mistake, and we always win, is the history. And the things that aren't, don't tell that story, we literally just don't do that part of history. It's not there. And so to then inform the American people about this reality is a lot of work. And so
Yes.
we have Michelle Alexander to thank for that in the New Jim Crow, in the decade of research behind that, not decades. And
when was that, Winnie?
I have it behind me. I want to say 2012, but maybe earlier than that.
Okay, but in the 21st century, we've waited until the 21st century for this. Okay.
And then what the New Jim Crow does is, I mean, it's just magisterial, frankly. It tells the history of slavery, but she's a lawyer, but her research draws from the history of slavery, the number of people enslaved in particular places, how that turned into sharecropping, the prison system, the labor of incarcerated people. Those percentages stay the same. It's shocking in certain areas. Just
change the form of how it's delivered.
Yes, and then
that's the message of the film 13 on Netflix,
exactly,
which I found so powerful.
Yes, exactly. That it becomes who were enslaved, and then the theology, as well as the sociology and the biology written to justify slavery, the enslavement of Black people, becomes the framing for the criminalization of Black people.
Yes.
It's shocking.
So, I mean, you've raised theology there, and I think people will be very interested about what you think the shifts in our theology need to be at this time that might be lagging a little bit, a century or so, for really generating a space and a place for moving forward to some sort of harmony that we do desire, but it may not be an easy step to it. What are your thinkings about that, please?
Yeah, so I went to Union Theological Seminary. So my sense, I'm from in New York, and we're not lagging behind. It just depends on what you're reading. There has been really important theological writing, significant, rigorous, from Black America and Black theologians for a very long time. I can just go to the 70s if we want to do that, but I can also take you to the 50s. We can go further back because Black Americans have been religious in our country and have been church folks historically. We get a lot of the great Black liberation thinking in our country as theology and in theological frameworks. Today, if you're going to read from scratch today, I would recommend Kelly Brown Douglas. And she is I won't tell you her age, but I can tell you that she is for at least 30 years, if not 40, for all of her theological work has been on the origins of race, where we get it, back to Tacitus, when we start to think about difference in Africa in relationship to Europe, and then how that fits into the theological categories that we use as Anglicans and as Protestants, and what that has meant for the Black body. If she holds the Black body at the center, so she does not assume all bodies are included when we say all or people, because that's not true. It's not true for women. It's not true for all kinds of, so she calls that particularity out, but she also is putting that right next to this study of how race has worked and how you see that in the literature as you see theology developing. And one of the very provocative statements she makes, but which will make sense to you, but it's extremely provocative, and she'll often lead with this, is that you can't be white and be a Christian. Mm-hmm. Now, if you think about that theologically, right, like what is whiteness, right? And whiteness is defined in opposition to Blackness, and it is defined as privilege and power, and it's not race. It is race, but it's not ethnicity, it's not family, it's not the people that love you, it's not actually the color of your skin, right? And maybe to make the point, my birth certificate says that I am white on the race category because I was born in Dallas, Texas in 1972. And in 1972, there was no category for Indian. And in the United States, an Indian is not Black. Black is of African descent, right? And I was not a Mexican, because Texas used to be Mexico. That was a category. And literally, I think, because because a nurse wouldn't have known the history of race in our country, right? And she filled that form out quickly. My guess is my mother was a nurse at that hospital. My father was a student at the university. And they are dark-skinned people. There's lots of Black people, a lot lighter skinned than us. But she put us in the category of whiteness, of privilege and a certain privilege and power. It's still on my birth certificate. So it's a made-up thing, right? And so she says you can't accept the privilege of whiteness and the basis for the argument that it should be privileged in a particular ways, and be a Christian. That the Christian vocation is to find those margins, find who stands at them, find who's excluded. And we are told by Jesus in the Gospels, that's where we will see the work of God. And it seems almost that that's only where God can work. So we've got to find that. And often in our communities, that's right among us. We don't have to go very far at all. But it does mean for all of us a constant questioning of who is excluded and why. How does power work in the communities that we live in? Who is disenfranchised by that power? And how do we participate in that power? And how do we work towards what is just and fair?
Okay, so we've got some reading to do here, some of us. In terms of your hopes for the next few weeks and months, I mean, because some big things could happen in the next few weeks and months. You know, what is your prayer around that? You know, what is your desire for the church to be in this learning time?
Yeah, you know, with all of this, I hope nothing I say sounds too flip or easy. I think this is a huge unsettling, right? And a good unsettling for all of us. We've all learned to work within the systems we have. My hope is that the church can take a very, very humble position in this. The church that I'm a part of, our churches have benefited enormously from the systems as the way they are. And within it, I think what's most dangerous about being a church person is we convince ourselves that we are good and worthy and innocent, which is a trait of whiteness, right? No one gets to be innocent but white people. And that we are innocent, it is not our fault, that we are, and by we, I mean the great we of all of us that go to church. We don't control history. We can't be held responsible. I think with great humility, the church has a lot of listening and learning to do. Dolores Williams, who's one of the founders of womanist theology, will say one of the great dangers of the church is that we glorify our suffering. You know, that we will say to a woman who's been harmed, you know, that we turn everything immediately into something reconciled or something redeemed, as opposed to noting that there are forces that will continue to harm, and that we should be about stopping that. And so I think it's dangerous that we don't claim our own power as the church to be a force for change. I think it's important that we listen with a lot of humility. We are complicit, all of us, and that we can take a lot. You know, we can hear about the injustices of the world and our ignorance of them, and not break. Like, people have not broken living with the suffering of the world. The least we can do, I think, is listen. I think the possibility in this moment in our country, and it's world shattering. One of my friends, Stephanie Spellers, who's a canon for the presiding bishop, said, if this nation was built on slavery, if that's foundational, then who are we without it? And it is that it's that shattering. And it should be. And for any of us that say it's not, or don't understand why resistance is so extreme, and it's not a small thing, it is shattering.
Absolutely.
But the church is one of those places that we actually hold that language, right? That we can repent of evil and turn. And that turning can be of things that we could not, that you can't imagine. You can't imagine the next day. You can't imagine the next step. And we're not reconciled. We're not finished in this life, except that we know that we are. Like, we know that this justice already exists. We know that the reign of God's justice exists and is stunning, and we desire it. So we can stand broken and not right and not perfect and not innocent and complicit, and work towards the better thing. And we're going to be all right. You know, our fulfillment is already out there, right? That's when, to me, the great teaching of the church is it's already done. We don't have to only do what we can imagine, right? Sometimes we can just take the next step that has integrity and is in solidarity, and know that we're going to be all right.
Winnie, thank you very much. You took off the shelves a prayer book before we started. Can I invite you to just lead us in something that helps us in those next steps?
Yeah, so This is literally from our prayer book. We use it at the Easter Vigil, and we use it at ordinations. But it's a prayer, I think, from the 5th century. So the Episcopal Church's prayer book, and it's been in our 1979 prayer book. So it's one we know well, but is quite powerful in this moment. O God of unchangeable power and eternal light, look favorably upon thy whole church, that wonderful and sacred mystery, and by the tranquil operation of thy perpetual providence, carry out the work of our salvation, and let the whole world feel and see that things which were cast down are being raised up, that those which had grown old are being made new, and that all things are returning into unity through him by whom all things were made, thy Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord.
Amen.
That would work for almost everything.
Yeah, it really sort of wraps it all up, doesn't it? Winnie, would you just bless us as we close?
Yeah. Yeah, I pray for all of us for courage in this time of great unrest, for clarity, and for the courage to move towards things that we cannot yet understand. And may God's blessing fall richly upon you, God who is creating, God who is liberating, and God who is the very breath of life. Amen.
Amen. Winnie, thank you so much for being with us, and I hope that the rest of your retreat leading goes well, and we look
Thank you very
forward
much.
to having you with us again on the boat in the future.
Thank you. Thanks so much for this.
God bless.